Thank you very much. We want to, first of all, welcome our 8th grade students from C.S. Porter Middle School who are sitting to the left of us. Thank you for coming today. I appreciate it. And if the rest of the day is anything like our first panel, it's going to be an exciting day today. So we really appreciate all the speakers that have presented so far and who will be speaking for the rest of today. The goal of this session is a conversation with key public stakeholders and policy people in the policy world around our state and including at the federal level to discuss the current and future challenges confronting our state in this area of human trafficking. I want to invite the moderator for this panel, Mr. Jim Taylor, the legal director of the ACLU of Montana.
Thank you. Welcome to everybody who's here, especially the students from CS Porter. Three of my kids went to Porter, and you're out in our neighborhood. So I'm glad you could make it today. It's a tough topic for anybody, and it's especially tough for our young people. But our young people are a lot of the people who are being trafficked too. Just a couple of things on the international perspective, and then we'll get to our topic, which is the prevalence of human trafficking in the United States and Montana. A couple of years ago, I had the opportunity to teach a course on international criminal law at the law school, and it wasn't too long after the tsunami in 2004. And one of the things that I learned in teaching that course is that on an international scale, one of the worst things about a natural disaster is that after a natural disaster, there will be groups from organized crime that will go to that area and swoop up the children. That on top of the disaster of the national tragedy like the tsunami and earthquakes, there will be groups of organized crime who will go in and take children whose parents have been lost, their guardians are lost, and swoop them up. And that was something that I had never considered. Also had a chance to live in China for a couple of years, and there is trafficking in China as well. And one of the things in China that's different than other places is that in China, it's often male children that are trafficked, and it's because of China's one-child policy, so that wealthy individuals who can't have another child would purchase a child on the market. And those are realities in our world that we just don't think about much. But today we're going to be talking about the prevalence of trafficking in Montana, some of the solutions that have been proposed, some of the actions that have been taken, and we have three great panelists today. We have Carla Croft, a supervisory special agent from the Civil Rights Unit with the FBI. Carla. We have Cyndee Peterson, who is an assistant U.S. attorney with Project Safe Childhood, and she's the coordinator of the Human Trafficking Task Force of the U.S. Attorney's Office in Montana. She does prosecutions that focus on online sexual exploitation of children and child pornography. And we have Dana Toole, who is a licensed clinical social worker. She spent 4 years directing the family law mediation program for Montana Legal Services. And since 2008, she has been coordinating the Montana Department of Justice Child Sexual Abuse Response Team. In 2012, she assumed responsibility for the Montana Department of Justice Children's Bureau. She has conducted hundreds of child forensic interviews for law enforcement, tribal law enforcement, and the FBI, and she's developed the first Montana forensic interview training now offered at the Montana Law Enforcement Academy. So those are our speakers today. So I'm going to start with asking a few questions from Carla to talk about the scope of the problem on a national level. In the United States, could you start with telling us what the federal definition of human trafficking is?
I think I'm on. I'm going to do my best to talk slowly. I tend to do things rapidly, everything, walking, talking, eating. so we'll see how that goes. Federally, our definition came from the Trafficking Victims Protection Act back in 2000, so it's a fairly recent law that we work off of now, and I appreciate that fact because it shows that we can change things as the problem evolves and as we understand it better. Essentially, in the United States definition, we do not include organ trafficking as is included in the United Nations definition, so that's something to point out. But we do include sex trafficking and labor trafficking, and it's essentially force, fraud, or coercion that's used to induce that. So that's the most simple definition.
Can you tell us from the federal perspective what you're seeing in terms of links to organized crime and trafficking?
Absolutely. Specifically, we've been seeing a lot of interaction with gangs when we're talking about sex trafficking, in particular of adults and minors, but in particular of minors. That's really become their new commodity. Traditionally, you look at drug trafficking and firearms trafficking, but it's now evolving into sex trafficking, and that's where they're making their money. Additionally, you'll see organized crime groups, Asian organized crime, Italian organized crime, that are also exploring the joys of human trafficking for their benefit.
One of the things that we're going to be talking about with all the panelists too is about how Indian country fits into the problem of human trafficking. And as I go through the questions today with the other panelists, if you want to jump in, if you have something you want to add, please do. Please do. Carla, can you tell us what the overall federal strategy is about how to combat trafficking?
Sure, we've actually been focusing on that this year in Washington, D.C., and noting that it's something very important that we need to look at, and that it's a vulnerable population that we might not have been placing enough emphasis and focus on in the past. Certain areas where there are more Indian country areas, such as Montana, Minnesota, Arizona, they've been experiencing it, but it's been not forgotten, but not at the forefront in other areas. And we're noticing that the more we look into it, the more we notice that it's something that we need to attack. We've been looking at working the way the Bureau is, the FBI is structured, and other agencies. There are people set to look into criminal investigations, and then from there you kind of specialize and work specific topics. We have Indian country as one topic, and they cover a wide variety of more violent crimes, but we also have our human trafficking and our child trafficking units. And in seeing some of the cases that have come through and looking at the training that we can do with our tribal communities, as well as our FBI, HSI, other agents that are working within those communities, the other state and local law enforcement partners, just to make them aware of what trafficking is and how to identify it, and then the resources that are available to help them to reach back out to our units that specialize in investigating trafficking and know the resources and the players, many of whom you're going to meet throughout this conference, such as the National Human Trafficking Resource Center, which I believe is going to represent a little bit later, those resources that are out there to help them combat that. So just, in fact, last week I was speaking with our folks that work in the Indian country, and we're going to be presenting a block at a training they have upcoming in June on all the issues they have in Indian country, but they've parceled out a section for us for human trafficking to begin to make those inroads. It's also something that's been addressed. I'm trying to remember who it was. I think it was the Lieutenant Governor that brought up the strategic action, the federal strategic action plan on victims, and that was something that was discussed by all the agencies that were represented there, myself included. I was present at those meetings and working on that action plan, and one of the emphasis that we all had was working in Indian country and making sure that it's attacked from the Native Americans as being victims of trafficking, as well as people coming into the reservations and abusing some of the facilities that they have there, such as the casinos and things like that, for promoting trafficking, thinking that they can skirt the laws by going in there.
Can you tell us a little bit, you've touched on this some, but can you tell us a little bit of what your duties are as program manager for the human trafficking investigations for the FBI?
Sure. Right now, I did cases and I missed them and I'm going back, but right now I'm just a facilitator working on policies and communication with other agencies to make sure we're on the same page and promoting our the benefits of working together. Task forces are amazing and absolutely essential in working on human trafficking cases, as well as getting the education out there. I'm glad to see the middle school students here because the Department of Education, ourselves, DHS, are partnering to work on some programs to get into the schools to help explain what trafficking is. We found a lot of our victims that we've worked with in the past who are now survivors were unaware that it could happen to them and kind of got taken aback by boyfriend-girlfriend, seeming boyfriend-girlfriend type relationships that were not such. It was a pimp coercing a minor, trying to get that minor to go out and work as a prostitute so he could make money. So getting that information out there and letting people know are some of the things that we've been working on and that I work on up at headquarters, budgeting as well, which isn't that exciting, but a very essential part to combating human trafficking.
Budgeting leads me to another question. Do you think you have the resources you need?
What I can say, what I can't say. It's always great to get additional funding. I know that all the folks that work the various programs would like additional funding, and I also know that we're in a tight fiscal year, but we have been encouraged by the funding that that Congress is looking at for combating human trafficking, and we hope that it continues to remain at the forefront of those who are really able to make a change in that arena. But anything that we can receive, we definitely have learned how to maximize with smaller budgets and are enjoying when it increases.
That's a very political answer. Can you
Thank
tell
you.
what
I've
would you
been
do
there
if you
for a
had
year
more
now.
resources?
Pardon?
What would you do if you had more resources?
One of the biggest things that I think we would do is fund task forces and victim specialists. They're huge, and then also agents and analysts to investigate. So just all around, the more people that you can bring into working on the problem, the better it is. Our role is not to fund shelters or things like that from the Bureau's perspective. We're investigators, but our victim services and getting task forces together and then being able to go out and work with our non-governmental or NGO partners in teaching, in referring victims, in getting that communication going. If there's a victim perhaps that will go into a shelter and doesn't feel comfortable speaking with law enforcement for whatever reason, being able to have that communication and trust there through having time to spend with the various shelters and other resources available would be helped by funding, because we have more agents and people that could reach out and spend that time there and get to know each other. It's relationships that really help this problem.
You talked about the task forces. Can you tell us who's part of the task forces, what their roles are, and a little bit about interagency cooperation?
Sure. There are over 169 task forces that the FBI is a part of, not necessarily FBI-led. Some are FBI-led and some we are on. Many are led by the U.S. Attorney's offices. Others are funded by the Department of Justice. So it's we really love to have prosecutors on those task forces, state, local, and federal law enforcement officers, and then additionally we'll bring in non-governmental organizations, those who support the victims and the survivors. Our victim specialists are also a part of those task forces. And when I say state, local, and federal, I'm talking, for example, I'm originally out of the San Diego area, and our task force had sheriff's department representatives from the majority of the local police departments in the county, as well as Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, Department of Labor, Department of Education, anyone who's in the area that can help, Health and Human Services as well, state and federal. So anyone that is available to help, we're looking into bringing on DEA. So anyone that comes in contact or could potentially come in contact with a victim, we are happy to have them join the task force for whatever participation and help they can give.
You mentioned the DEA. Is there a connection between human trafficking and narcotics trafficking?
There is, as I'd mentioned a little bit earlier, local gangs in particular are traditionally known for trafficking drugs. However, they are trafficking children and adults as well in the sex trafficking. So when they're out there doing their investigations and looking for their narcotics trafficking, it is highly probable that they'll run across sex and labor trafficking as well. And so anyone that we can get educated on the topic that can be the eyes and ears for us and report back and help us if it's something they can't take on due to other constraints, they can pass the case off to a task force that's more than willing to work it.
On a national level, can you tell us anything about the demographics of who's being trafficked?
Sure. Based off of the investigations that we've been doing, a large portion of the trafficking victims we see here in the United States are United States citizens. They come from affluent families, from families that are impoverished. They are young, they are old. It's a very wide spectrum. There are also folks that are trafficked here from other countries, but to think that your community is immune would be somewhat naive. So it's very important to be aware of some of the characteristics of potential victims of trafficking.
So to get back to the central question for the panel, then on a national level, how prevalent is human trafficking in the United States?
It's fairly prevalent. It's in every community. Some places it's more easily identified, and it's definitely more easily identified when it's sex trafficking, which is for the simple fact that prostitution is illegal, and so it gives law enforcement an in. When you have labor trafficking, you can have someone who's working at a restaurant who's being trafficked working alongside someone who's working at a restaurant who is not being trafficked. And it's not illegal to work at a restaurant. It's not illegal to work in the hospitality industry. So it makes it a little bit more difficult to identify those cases. And that's where also partners in those industries come into play. We love to get calls from people who are maybe working in construction and say, hey, this one crew is consistently underbidding us. I don't know how they're doing it. And then realizing that maybe there's a problem with their labor there, and it's not just a matter of not paying them, but it's actually a trafficking situation, which is one of the reasons why we'd work with Department of Labor. So anyone that has an opportunity to go in and look and inspect any industry will help us to uncover trafficking.
AUSA Peterson, what can you tell us about trafficking, how the federal government is trying to combat trafficking in Montana?
So there's so many things I want to say, and I wanted to actually jump in with Carla on a couple different topics. But so first I want to talk about what we have done. Carla mentioned the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000, and that was a huge act that was passed and sort of a huge milestone when it comes to the federal laws, because what happened before that time frame is the laws that we had in place made it very, very difficult to prosecute trafficking crimes, especially because of some different interpretations of those laws by the United States. But once we passed that act, we immediately saw a huge increase. In fact, I think it was 360% between 2001 and 2007 in terms of the prosecution of trafficking. So it just skyrocketed. And then in 2007, our Civil Rights Unit actually added the Human Trafficking Protection Unit, specifically focused again on trafficking. So it's been a slow build at the federal standpoint, and then the next sort of big jump that occurred was in 2001 when the Department of Justice passed the Human Trafficking Enhanced Enforcement Initiative. And what that did is they directed every United States Attorney's Office in the United States to coordinate and put together a task force specifically to combat human trafficking. And so that's what we did here in Montana, is we started that in 2012. And so we have the Montana Human Trafficking Task Force that's in place. Right now we have federal partners, we have state partners. So the HSI is on board, Border Patrol, our office, FBI, IRS, the BIA. The Montana Department of Justice has been very involved, both with DCI, the Children's Justice Center, the Attorney General's office has been involved, so has the Department of Family Services. We also have victim specialists on board, And what we do is we get together at least quarterly, and we sort of focus on what we're going to do as a task force. Our initial plan and our initial goal was to reach out right away and to start doing training. So that's been our #1 goal and what we have continued to do since we have formed. Eventually, we want to expand that task force, but right now, that's our focal point. When we get together, we talk about potential cases that we've received. The law enforcement will talk about it together. Our goal is all about collaboration when it comes to investigating those, and then again, we're reaching out to try to do training primarily on law enforcement, but Dana and I were just talking about this morning how we also need to start reaching out to some of our victim specialists and different agencies that will sort of be the first responders, so to speak, in terms of what they need to do. So that was one of the steps that we're doing in Montana. We have a lot more. Another thing that's been happening in Montana is that we have a lot of local human trafficking task forces that are being formed. So we have one in Missoula. We have one in Flathead that's been very active. It's my understanding that they're forming one in Billings. They've been discussing it in Helena, discussing it in Great Falls. So all of the local agencies are also looking at that, and we're hoping to eventually be collaborating and coordinating with them also. The biggest thing that we have learned about trafficking is that we cannot stand alone and do this. It is all sorts of crime. It comes in the form from tax evasion and money laundering to violent crime to drug crime to crimes against children. So if we aren't talking, we are going to miss the boat. And everybody has realized that, and that's why there's such a focus on collaboration. And I can tell you from our task force standpoint, there are no egos and there's nothing territorial at all about our task forces. FBI cooperates with HSI, and the feds cooperate with the locals and the tribal and everything like that. So the other thing that we have going at about the same time that we started our human trafficking task force, our U.S. Attorney Michael Cotter initiated a goal in early 2012 that was officially launched in October of 2013 called Project Safe Bakken. And that was a goal to address not only human trafficking, but a wide variety of crimes that are occurring over in the Bakken. But of course, trafficking is a huge part of that. And I'm going to read from my list because I don't want to miss anybody. But it includes the United States attorneys from Montana and North Dakota. It includes the attorney generals from Montana and North Dakota, the DEA, the FBI, ATF, BIA, EPA, DHS, Border Patrol, the Marshals, the Montana DCI, the North Dakota DCI. So you can see how many agencies have come to the table realizing that we have to work together if we're going to combat this. And that's exactly what has happened, and that's exactly what our goal has been with regards to eastern Montana, specifically in the Bakken. So what was happening with the local law enforcement is they were quickly becoming overwhelmed because they're responding minute by minute. You have to be reactive. My background comes from being in local prosecution, so I understand that. It's just different. But if we could come in as state and federal agencies like DCI and like FBI and other organizations, then we can establish a long-term presence, and we can initiate investigations like trafficking that really demand long-term, high-intensity sort of resource-driven investigations. So FBI, frankly, were the first people to the plate in terms of putting a resident agent actually over in the Bakken area. They have an RE in Cyndee. DCI and DEA also have a strong presence, and so do ATF and a bunch of others. The locals have just been a huge part of Project Safe Bakken as well. So we have that going. In terms of Indian country, which you mentioned, the United States Attorney's Office has a handful of AUSAs that are designated for each reservation in Montana. And part of what the AUSAs do is they spend at least 4 to 8 days a month on their reservation and meeting with officials. We have multidisciplinary teams in place. We have child protection teams in place. So that also is sort of a way to have our ear to the ground and to make sure that we're listening and finding out if there's trafficking going on. The one thing that I wanted to mention and sort of expand on that Agent Croft mentioned was organized crime getting into trafficking. And so there's things that we know, especially among sex trafficking, which is pimps follow the money, no questions asked. That is they move their girls around the country and around to different locations wherever the money is. That is why the Bakken is such a huge concern to us, because that is where the money is right now. So it's not a question of, is this going to come into the Bakken? It is there. We have to make sure that everybody knows how to recognize it, knows who to report it to, knows who to investigate it, make sure that we have the victim services in place and things of that nature. The other thing that's happening with organized crime is that organized crime leaders are very smart. These are not dumb people that don't know what they're doing. They are basically CEOs of their business, and they know where the money is. And what they have quickly realized is there is much less risk and much more profit in selling a person than selling drugs. Because when you sell drugs, your resource is depleted once you've sold it. You're done. But with a person, you can take that same resource and sell it over and over and over and over again. And so this is why all of the organized crime and all of the pimps are starting to get into that instead of drug dealing. The other thing that happens, unfortunately, is that when human trafficking is busted, the people that get caught are not the organized crime leaders. It's not the pimps typically. It's the girls standing on the street, or it's the girls in the hotel rooms that get busted for prostitution because of the coercion that goes on, and which is severe, and you're going to hear about it in the next day and a half. They don't give up the pimps. They're trained to specifically not give up the pimps. There's a number of ways that this happened, but the bottom line is the dealers of the people are not getting caught. So it's much easier for them to run this from afar than it is to stand down on the street corner with their drugs and peddle it. So these are the issues that we're so concerned about. You know, I can give you an example of pimps moving the girls around to where the money is. Last year at Sturgis, they had 9 arrests through the U.S. Attorney's Office of sex trafficking at Sturgis. And that's exactly what pimps do. They move the girls to the Super Bowl. They move the girls to the NCAA basketball tournament. They take it to Sturgis. They take it to the Bakken. That is exactly their whole goal. It is what they do. So that's why we're trying to be ahead of the game and really sort of jumping in.
So what's your strategy for moving up the food chain, trying to get the pimps, trying to get organized crime?
Well, that is hard, and it just is very difficult. I think that our #1 strategy has to be in having trained first responders. And when I say first responders, I mean the law enforcement officers, because we have to start treating them as victims immediately. We have to know how to respond to a victim of trafficking, and that's not just sex trafficking, that's labor trafficking too. You know, a lot of times they'll just be immediately treated as an illegal alien or something as opposed to a victim. So we really have to flip that switch in our brain and get our first responders to flip that switch in the brain. But the other thing that's huge is we need to have resources in place that are going to be responsive to that. And again, that's something that Dana and I have talked about in terms of what would we do? What would we do in Montana? This is what the task forces need to focus on. If we got a call this afternoon that said somebody was being labor trafficked 7 miles north of Missoula on some kind of a ranch, and we think that there are 15 victims housed up in a warehouse that are from whatever country, where do we get the translator who can speak to them? Who do we send up? Where are we going to house them? You don't put victims in detention. You don't put victims in foster care. And Dana can speak a lot more to that with regards to the children. But these are all of the things that make human trafficking cases very complex, and a huge part of it is that we need to be able to get them to talk, especially when it comes to labor trafficking, and keep them on board and cooperating so that we can get up the chain.
Okay, you mentioned that sometimes victims are treated just as illegal aliens, and one of the things I wanted to ask was, in 2000, when the Trafficking Victim Protection Act was passed, it allows for up to 5,000 T visas to be issued each year to victims of trafficking, people from other countries that are here, but there's only been about 8.5% of those visas authorized that have ever been issued. So almost 92% of those visas have never been issued. Why is that?
So I had to find the answer to that question because I did not know, and I reached out, and what I was told is that there's not only T visas that are available, but there's also a visa called a U visa. And from the way it was explained to me, apparently a lot more people are qualifying and are obtaining U visas, and that's one of the reasons why we're not seeing the specific numbers with regards to T visas. To be eligible for a T visa, the victim must be a victim of a severe form of trafficking and have to meet a federal definition for sex, labor trafficking, force, fraud, coercion. To be eligible for a U visa, the victim must be a victim of one of a number of additional crimes. And so what happens is oftentimes it's much easier to qualify for a U visa, and so it's my understanding that that's what they are getting instead of the T visa. Although I was told also that the Department of Homeland Security Blue Campaign and ICE have done a lot of work on training law enforcement officers on every level of indicators of human trafficking of the victims, and because of that, they believe because of that, they're currently on pace to receive the most T visa applications in the history of the program. They said, again, it's not going to come close to the 5,000 statutory cap, but that it is increasing.
It is increasing, okay.
Can I just jump in there really quick as well?
Sure.
In addition to that, not being able to come to the cap, it just has to do with the identification and working of the cases, because one of the things that is required for the T visa is that there is a reasonable amount of cooperation. Now that from the victim. Now there are also incidents where the victim is underage or not able to cooperate. That's kind of excused. But if those victims aren't identified, if the cases aren't brought to us, that oftentimes we'll get calls, hey, there's this trafficking going on, but we can't tell you anything about it. And if we can't go and identify it and that victim can't get identified, then that victim is never going to be brought forth to be able to qualify for the T visa or receive the resources that he or she needs in order to get there. And the T visa is not something that is issued by law enforcement. It's something that we can share with them, but we're not going to do the paperwork for that. It's going to be the non-governmental organizations or the immigration attorneys or people of that nature. So they also need to be educated on that. That's an option out there to be discussed along with the U visa, because as Cyndee said, the U visa is a little bit more well-known than the T visa.
Well, Dana, let's bring you in the conversation. What kind of services are out there for victims of trafficking?
Well, that's a really good question. So one of the things that I think is represented on this panel that is really beneficial for everybody here today is this is the partnership. This is the federal-state partnership. And it's real, and we're meeting and we're talking on an ongoing basis about how to best address all of the crimes and abuses that are affiliated with human trafficking. And what Cyndee does by coordinating our Montana Human Trafficking Task Force is helps at the state level, the Montana Department of Justice, work with Montana communities to start to develop individualized community responses to actual rescued human trafficking victims. And right now in Montana, we're on the edge of those discussions. The task force in Missoula, the task force in Flathead County, on a local level are starting to talk about if we rescue, I a young woman from sex trafficking. This is a very unique kind of a survivor. They have not had any control over, by and large, maybe even their body in any way. They've been told when they can sleep, when they can eat, what to wear. We actually know from research that pimps will restrict the caloric intake of one of the girls to keep her thin so she's more marketable. So when we get these victims in our local communities and we need to take care of them, Cyndee's right. We have to recognize right away that these are not criminals. These folks, they need to be responded to with compassion and very basic care. So around the state, in conjunction with Child and Family Services and some other social services agencies, we're starting to talk about if we had a victim in Lewistown, what are the services in that community? Because those are very different than the services in Billings or Missoula or Hardin. And we are starting to try to engage our domestic violence coalitions around the state and our domestic violence shelters, because they are a wealth of expertise already just in knowing their community resources, where we can keep people safe. So we're starting all of those conversations statewide.
That brings me to another question. In the last legislature, the Montana legislature passed a bill to allow prostitution convictions to be vacated for trafficking victims. To your knowledge, have any of those convictions ever been overturned yet?
I don't know of any. Nope, not yet.
Okay. Cyndee, to get back to you for a second, the 2012 you formed the Montana Human Trafficking Task Force. Are the tribal governments members of that task force?
They are not. We have BIA on right now, and but eventually that is our goal. So at the current time, our AUSAs are sort of acting as the liaison in terms of bringing any issues to the table. They would report it to me, and then I would take it to the task force so that we could visit with the other members.
Why is that? Why are the tribes not members of the task force?
Well, because when we first started out, you know, it was sort of a blank slate in terms of putting this together. And when I originally reached out, it was myself and Border Patrol and HSI, and I think FBI was at the meeting the following month. And we were trying to decide, how do we move forward, where do we start, and what steps do we take, and how do we move forward? And so the first thing that we thought about is that we have to get our finger on the pulse throughout Montana in terms of what kind of trafficking is going on and what do people know. And when you bring law enforcement agencies together, one of the biggest things that we wanted to be able to do is talk about the allegations of the crime, but we wanted to be able to do it from a standpoint that it was somewhat controlled too. And so we were fearful that if we just exploded and immediately brought tons of people to the table, that it would get too large and we wouldn't be able to have our meetings like we wanted to have our regular meetings. We wouldn't be able to discuss the things that we wanted to discuss. So there are a lot. I literally have a binder with a tab that says additional members and agencies that we want to add. And as our task force expands, those are the additional groups that we're going to bring to the table so that they can be members of it. And it is going to include elected officials. It will include NGOs, and it will, you know, Montana Highway Patrol. There's just so many people that we need. But so I guess the short answer after that is because we're still sort of in infancy and we are still growing and we just haven't reached that point.
So you do have plans to include them?
Yes.
And Jim, if I could speak to that, although we are, I mean, just last meeting was when we added Child and Family Services. So we're adding people as quickly as we can. But the absence of tribal leadership on our state task force doesn't mean that we don't have a response to child victims of crime and adult victims of crime on all of our reservations in our tribal communities. We have very well established multidisciplinary teams in each of our tribal communities in Montana that are trained in responding to child victims of sexual assault and other crimes. We have a regional multidisciplinary team that a regional tribal multidisciplinary team in Montana in the eastern part of the state that responds to cases that may come off any one of a number of reservations involving child victims of trafficking or crime. So the absence of that leadership on our task force does not equate to nothing happening in Indian country, because there's a lot going on in terms of training and education in Indian country in Montana about crimes against children and human trafficking.
In many cases, victims of trafficking usually come from people that are poor, that are disadvantaged. For sex trafficking, it's usually females that have been, or males that have been victims of sexual abuse previously. Is that something that equates with Indian country?
Yes. Yeah, it does equate with Indian country. Any crime or abuse that could happen to an individual anywhere in the country can also occur in Indian country. And we know that in Indian country poverty is increased, and a lot of other risk factors are higher, and so the incidences of crime and abuse and violence unfortunately really are higher. And one of the things that I wanted to take the opportunity to say today, especially since we have middle school folks here, and this is an important opportunity for all of you to learn more about this, is that in the United States, for about the last 30 years of child sexual assault research, we know that 1 of every 4 American female children is sexually assaulted by the time she's 18. And we know that 1 of every 6 American male children is sexually assaulted by the time they're 18, and we suspect that that's underreported. So I really appreciated Dr. Farley today when she said, let's demystify human trafficking and not set it in a category that's somehow different from prostitution, sex crimes, labor crimes of other types. Let's not treat the children differently than we do the adults. And Carla said folks that get trafficked in the United States actually come from many different socioeconomic levels, from poverty to affluence. But one really important connection that I want to make today is if we know that 25% of our girls in the United States and 30% approximately of our boys are being sexually assaulted as children, and we know that, that makes them more vulnerable to being trafficked because of all of the factors that go along with being sexually assaulted as a child, then there is a really clear connection between needing to respond in our communities to child sexual assault really effectively as fast as we find it to prevent those young people from being much more at risk of being trafficked.
Cyndee, in terms of Project Safe Bakken, that's a separate task force from the Human Trafficking Task Force?
Correct.
Are there tribal government members on that task force?
Now let me look at my list. No, there are not specifically. They're all other federal and state agencies.
Why is that?
You know, I don't know that because I'm actually not part of Project Safe Bakken. There's another AUSA that is on that, and I don't know if that's something that they're looking to expand. But my guess is that they were primarily reaching out to the different law enforcement agencies, and the FBI and HSI and BIA are really the ones that are doing the long-term investigations in eastern Montana and western North Dakota, along with the state DCI agencies.
And this could be either you or Dana. Can you talk about when Montana first really started responding to the threat of human trafficking as a state?
Well, I think that we've always responded to human trafficking. So that's kind of a difficult question. I mean, I know that our office had prosecuted a case in 2009 that was, frankly, the investigation started before 2000, before the Trafficking Act, literally, and it ended up, it was a massage parlor in Billings, and they ended up being convicted of money laundering charges, but that was a human trafficking investigation. And so So I think that we've always sort of been investigating at the state and the federal level. I would say that we have sort of put a spotlight on or really focused on it a lot more in the last 4 to 5 years.
In terms of trafficking, and this is for any of the panelists, people that are being trafficked in Montana, are they being trafficked into Montana, through Montana, or from Montana?
All. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Do you have any numbers, any data, any estimates?
No, so the data and the numbers are always hard, and I get that question a lot because they do say, well, then how come we don't have any convictions on the books in terms of the sex trafficking of a child, for example. And so the number one thing that I would say is that the majority of the time, sex trafficking and labor trafficking does not necessarily present as trafficking and is not necessarily prosecuted under those specific statutes, just like the example that I just gave you. So that's the first thing, that it's difficult to quantify. The other thing is I don't think we really have had a bunch of people tallying the numbers and stuff historically. That's just starting to happen right now. I can tell you, and I don't want to step on Polaris Project's toes because I know that there's going to be a whole separate presentation on that, but in terms of the calls that they have been receiving, that has really gone through the roof. And again, I think that's a huge part of education and teaching not just law enforcement but members of the public what trafficking looks like and when to make those calls. So that's on the uprise. In terms of why we know, for example, on reservations, we have had a victim that was trafficked off of a reservation in southern Montana that ended up down in Florida. It was completely through deception. She met this guy that was going to be, I can't remember exactly how old she was. She was early teens. Met this guy online, wanted to get away from her family, and he was, of course, the knight in shining armor, and she promptly got on a bus and went down to Florida and was immediately put into a sex trafficking ring. And so that's one example of one of a Montana native victim that was trafficked out of Montana. I can tell you right now, as I sit here, we have an allegation of trafficking of a victim in eastern Montana on a reservation. I can't speak about it because it's ongoing. Again, we know that pimps follow the money, so we absolutely know that people are bringing girls through. In Missoula, we had the Oliver case in 2012 where a pimp brought a couple of his girls in actually and was putting them on Backpage, or I think it was on Backpage. And he was charged with numerous counts of transportation of a minor with the intent to engage in sexual activity. But that was a pimp bringing the girls in, moving them through specifically. There's another case that's pending right now in Missoula County where a pimp picked up a local Missoula girl, 17 years old, and was attempting to pimp her out. So a Montana girl being pimped right then and there. So yes, all of the above. It's happening everywhere.
Well, and one of the challenges is we can only know about it if we can see it. And so one of the phrases associated with human trafficking is it's hiding in plain sight. So we may see a couple of teenagers walking down Higgins Avenue and think that those are just kids in our community and they've got the iPods and all the stuff that you guys all have. One of them may be fine, the other one may be being trafficked, and we wouldn't necessarily have a visual cue to why that is, like we do with other crimes. One of the other things that's evolving in human trafficking is it is oftentimes our medical providers who are the first people in our community who actually have a victim present in their ER, in their clinic, in their office. And so there's a tremendous effort nationally to start training our physicians, our family practice folks, our pediatricians, our ER docs, to know what to look for when someone comes to their facility that they might be able to report trafficking. And interestingly enough, you would think that trafficking victims are presenting medically for neglect when, maybe not getting enough to eat, being dehydrated, being maltreated in some way where they've been deprived of basic needs, when in fact that's not true, and the medical research is starting to show that the pimps actually make sure that their girls get basic medical care. And so they may present as fairly healthy except for a particular injury. And there's a list of questions being developed now for medical providers to start using in ERs to screen for human trafficking, and hopefully that will start to be something that we could help the medical folks in Montana learn more about. But medical people are going to be a front line for us in identifying trafficking.
Sure.
One thing that Cyndee had brought up, and it kind of goes along the same lines but a slight tangent, is a case that she spoke about where the victim was recruited off of Facebook, and that is very common and has been. It was MySpace before Facebook, and as MySpace has kind of fizzled out and lost popularity, it's now back onto Facebook, and that's something really important for all of us to know as aunts, uncles, parents, sisters, friends. Do not accept people you don't know on your Facebook, because the pimps go out there and they troll it. Whether you're an adult or a child, they will troll it, and if your Facebook is open and you say something about how you're having a bad day and you're in a fight with your mom or your job is terrible, they attack that and they talk sweet nothings on your Facebook, and oh, no one should treat you like that and that's not okay, and I'll help you out and you come down here and I'll take care of you, and they get you out so fast, and that is common across the country. It is a regular occurrence. Do not use your Facebook account to friend people you do not know. And if someone tries to hit you up in that way, let a parent know, let somebody know that can look into that, because it's not okay, and it happens all too often, and that's how we're getting kids from all walks of life. People that you think are completely fine. They have two parents in their home. They've got brothers and sisters. They are part of community groups, sports at school, whatever. They have a bad day, and you post that on Facebook, and your Facebook isn't closed, and you're accepting requests from people you do not know. Those people are going to try to recruit you. And if you're having a bad day and you're not in a good frame of mind, you're willing to listen to what they're saying, and off you go.
The other thing that I would add to that, too, is that victims don't present as victims a lot of times because they don't think they're a victim. And so that goes back to, too, in terms of our very first contact and our first, interaction is so important, because the manipulation and the coercion that goes, their minds are not thinking the way we would necessarily be thinking because of all of the manipulation that has occurred. And so a lot of times when these girls do leave, and boys, but when they are coaxed out of their homes and coaxed into these situations, it's under the guise that this is their boyfriend, or this is, the person that is going to take care of them. And oftentimes it does start out that way. It doesn't last that long before they're required to turn tricks for the love of the boyfriend so that he can buy the drugs or he can do whatever it is. But I think that people have this persona that victims, especially in the sex trafficking industry, why don't they just walk away? And maybe they're just runaways, or they're just people after drugs, or and that is not at all. If you look at the numbers and you look at the victims and the studies that have been done, that's some of them for sure that are runaways, and I believe the stat on that is when children run away, I think it's within 48 hours. I think 48 hours, it might be 72, but I believe it's about within 2 days. Typically, they will turn to the sex industry just to pay for food, just to pay for somewhere to stay. And so the pimps are constantly on the lookout for those vulnerable children. And so that is the person that they want. They are going to try to go after the person that they know that they can manipulate and can control, and any little thing like that on the Facebook of my parents don't understand me, I just need somebody that's going to treat me like an adult, and they are going to swoop in 3 seconds, and that's the child that they want, because that's the child that they're going to be able to control and make all the money off of.
Dana, do you have anything you wanted to add to that?
I was just thinking, one of the things you said, Cyndee, so one of the things that's hard about responding appropriately and effectively to a rescued human trafficking person is a lot of rational approaches first responders might use historically to respond to victims of other crimes do not work with this population. They just don't work. there isn't anything rational about their thought process when they are first out of the life or the game. And the other thing that I saw recently in a presentation was all of us who might respond need to remember that we don't look any different than the people who were paying for their services. So the first thing we're going to have to overcome is that we look just like the perpetrators because they're being trafficked out to businesses, to middle-class Americans. That's a pretty big hurdle to get over and things we need to learn more about as first responders.
That gets us back to the question of training too. Can you talk about the kinds of training that are being provided, Cyndee, through the task force, or Dana or Carla, in terms of helping people understand the problem, the first responders especially?
Sure. So we immediately started reaching out and went around all over the state, actually, and we've trained all sorts of federal and state and local law enforcement officers. We've trained, I was up in Glasgow, I was over in Cyndee, in Havre, we've been in Bozeman, you know, all different groups, everything from sheriffs at the FBI Academy to Border Patrol agents and Montana Highway Patrolmen at a conference in Sydney, to honestly any group that will have us and will listen to us. We show up and start talking to them about what the state and the federal laws look like, what we have to prove, what they should be looking for, and we really start going over the force, fraud, and coercion elements and things of that nature. Also, I know that Brian Lockerbie has gone around and has done trainings in addition to Dana. You went up and spoke to the judges at the Judge Coalition, and Brian was recently at the Native American Coalition in Great Falls that he spoke to. I was invited to speak at the Native American, it was an Indian country seminar that they had in Billings, and unfortunately there was a blizzard that came in and I got cut. So I didn't get to, they closed the conference an hour before, but I was going to speak to them in terms of the manipulation and why victims stay and what it looks like. So we're getting ready to go back to the highway patrolmen. We're getting ready to go to social workers. We've talked about teachers and educators. I don't know how we're going to get in there, but we're trying. So literally everything and anywhere that we can go, we will.
Do you quantify that? Can you tell me how many people you've trained since you formed the task force?
Oh, I did not bring that stat. I'm sorry. You know, I would say, well, at the Board of Crime Control alone, that was big.
That was big.
Maybe around, I would say maybe around 400 or 500.
Yeah.
Okay.
In addition to the things that Cyndee brought up, and I'm sure they're teaching this, and it sounds like it's in there, but just to kind of bring that to the forefront, is a victim-centered approach. We train people on the law, we train officers about the elements of the crime and what we need to be able to get the case prosecuted, which is very important so that the pimps don't continue, the pimps or the traffickers, if it's a labor case, don't continue to manipulate and force people into doing things they don't want to. But to understand, as Cyndee had pointed out and as Dana had pointed out, the victims typically aren't thinking the same. There's this force, fraud, or coercion that's going on in the background, and they're typically not going to self-identify and say, oh, help me, rescue me, I'm a victim. Very rarely. In the cases that I worked, I had 2 in 4 years that did that. And the law enforcement and the first responders, whether it's a medical professional or someone working in juvenile justice or a highway patrolman, need to understand that that's not what's going to happen, that it's going to take a lot of time and patience, and trust. A relationship needs to develop so that the victim can trust that you aren't the John that they were going to see, or you're not in business with the labor trafficker, that you are there to help them and they can trust you and begin to tell their story. And you're going to get many stories that are not the full truth before you finally get to that truth, and it's going to come out bit by bit, but it's the trust and being honest with your victim that's going to break down those barriers, because they've had to put them up because of the situations they've been in.
Is that difficult in terms of prosecution of the cases? Because I know from doing criminal defense, if I had a witness who had told 3 or 4 or 5 different versions of the story, that's a lot easier case to defend than it is to prosecute.
Sure, but there's ways that we can combat that. We combat it with experts that come on and talk about the cycle of prostitution and what happens and the very nature of it. So we can explain it. It's not insurmountable. Is it more difficult? Yes. Impossible? No.
And when you do get to that, the whole story or the majority of the story, you're going to have other evidence that supports that, and so you go and you can verify those statements that are being made, and they're definitely prosecutable.
Yeah.
Which is
Dana, I noticed that you've developed some interview techniques for the Montana Law Enforcement Academy for forensic interviews of children. Have you done some specifically for victims of trafficking?
You know, first of all, I want to say I didn't develop the techniques because those are nationally researched, and I don't want anybody to hear or see that and think I'm taking credit for it. But I did put together the first in-state child forensic interviewing class at the academy. And we do that twice a year now, and it's a 40-hour class, and it's very good. But yes, I have interviewed children who have been victimized through technology. So in essence, they were online, they were persuaded perhaps to, via the camera on their computer, send pictures of their body to someone that was probably posing as another peer or someone that they felt comfortable and safe and in a trusting relationship with, when in fact what was on the other end of the computer was a child pornography producer. And those children and young people, it's really interesting, sometimes struggle emotionally after they find out how betrayed they were. Not to minimize any victim, but that betrayal, when they really thought they were in control of the relationship, can be as difficult or harder to recover from than an actual hands-on offense, oddly enough. Yeah, I've sat with those kids.
Are you developing interviewing techniques for law enforcement, though, in dealing with victims of trafficking?
Yep, we can train law enforcement to do appropriate interviews with trafficking victims. A lot of that is ongoing research that's occurring right now in the field of interviewing, victim interviewing, both adults and children. How do we compassionately introduce perhaps a video of their victimization to them? How do we do that? How do we do that and then support them with mental health care that helps them get through that, having to see their own victimization, those kinds of things. Very, very dynamic field in law enforcement and child protection right now. There's a lot going on there.
What can you tell us about, and this is for any of the panel, what can you tell us about any statistical information you can give us about the impact of the Bakken on crime?
So again, I would say that, I mean, all we know is just from the standpoint of the number of calls and the overall crime that is being increased. And again, we know that where the other crimes are occurring and where the population explosions are occurring and where the money is being made, human trafficking is going to occur. So it's just historically we know that that's happening, but in terms of numbers, we don't have that yet. I don't have any sort of statistics that say that, you know, we have, it's gone up 200% or anything. I just don't have any of that.
Is there any effort to develop that information?
You know, I think that there's always an effort to develop money because, if I may be frank, typically that you need to develop numbers in order to get funding. So I would assume that people are going to start tracking those numbers. I know that we, of course, track numbers in terms of the training that we do and, of course, and in terms of the prosecutions that we do. I also know that the Montana Board of Crime Control has really been trying to start tracking and put together numbers because they want to know it, the legislature wants to know it, everybody, you know, the governor's office, the attorney general's office, everybody wants these kinds of numbers. So I would say yes, I think that there are efforts to start putting together and tracking those specific numbers.
going to save a little bit of time for questions, so I'm going to ask each of you then if you could give us your thoughts on what we need to do to move forward. Do we need more laws? Do we need more law enforcement? Do we need more education? Do we need all of the above?
Yes.
Yes, well,
Short answer. No, all of the above. It has to do with education. It has to do with the amount of law enforcement that you can put to it, the resources that you have for the survivors afterwards, and then engaging people in that conversation. And then it has been kind of brought up, engaging everyone, but at the same time doing it in a manageable, effective way, as opposed to just kind of a hodgepodge of ideas that don't get interacted on. One of the things that I think was a good example of that was the Federal Strategic Action Plan on Victims. It was a large group. There was, I mean, everyone was represented from Department of Defense to Education to State, Department of Justice. Everyone was there. There was a forum for those who weren't in federal government to comment, and those comments and suggestions were incorporated as well into the policy. And so it's managing. So there are a lot of really good ideas out there, and some are very practical. Some are not, and so it's looking at those and working to see what will bring about the better good, and the greater good, and getting this addressed effectively.
On the federal level, is there a need for a new national law related to trafficking?
TVPA has been, and has been regularly renewed, has been amazing. I think as we notice new trends and things, that we fortunately live in a country where that's something that can always be addressed. So if there's something that's brought up and we see through our investigations and prosecutions and through the communities of a better way to address it or changes that need to be made, that's always something that can do. And there's constant communication between the various agencies and the legislative branch in making those changes as needed.
Dana, from your perspective?
So I was looking at the federal action plan, and I think there's 4 overarching sections of that plan, and one of them really focuses on collaboration, that all of the agencies responsible for responding to human trafficking need to be in clear, positive communication with each other on an ongoing basis. And to me, what needs to happen going forward is that we continue to develop those collaborations and really turn it into a high-functioning team approach where every agency knows and executes their own mandates and trusts the other agencies responding to also know and execute their own mandates all the way down the line from the time the report comes in until the rescued survivor has actually received adequate care and support and the case gets put together for prosecution and goes to trial. Can we do that? We absolutely can do that, because we do that with a number of other types of responses now in Montana and in the United States, and work with the FBI and the tribes and all of the other agencies that need to be at the table. It is challenging at the outset to identify roles and responsibilities clearly so that everyone knows how to operate moving forward, and I think that's the point where we're coming up on in Montana now, is we need to have the time at the table to identify the roles and responsibilities of all the agencies that are responding, so that as these cases come in, we can do a really best practice response.
Cyndee?
You know, yes, to everything that has been said, I agree. I think that the hardest part is always sort of having enough resources to address everything that we have. And I know for me personally, I would love to do this, and I could spend my time doing nothing but this. But of course I can't. Being the human trafficking coordinator is this much of my time in terms of everything else that I'm doing and juggling. So of course we can always use more resources. I would love to have a dedicated AUSA that prosecuted the cases and that went around and did all of the trainings, but instead we sort of try to juggle it and put it together the best that we can. I thank heavens that we do have a lot of NGOs in our local communities that are really stepping up, and I think that's going to play a huge, huge role, because those are the people that can carry the torch and sort of plug push forward with regards to victim services and keeping the rest of us sort of on course. Little tiny things that just crop up as you attend conferences like this. When I was sitting here this morning listening to Director Farley speak, and she was talking about the laws. Okay, so first of all, my hat as AUSA is coming off. The comments out of my mouth are not coming from the Department of Justice. This is me, Cyndee Peterson, personally now commenting. The one thing that she said was talking about keeping the prostitution crimes on the John's records. And I looked at Dana at the break and I said, what an easy, simple thing to go in and modify the prostitution statute in Montana to include a one-liner that says, if you're convicted as the buyer of sex, that you are not entitled and cannot get a deferred imposition of sentence. Because otherwise, the way the Montana laws are written is you are presumed to be entitled to a deferred imposition. So, in other words, we need to bolster and support our judges and give them what they need in order to say, okay, John Doe, this isn't good. You're not going to get a deferred on this. For when defense attorneys are standing there and saying, but Your Honor, he's entitled to a deferred. You go in and you make that quick switch. How easy. So these conferences like that, I think, are so important because those are, and I never even thought about it before. It never even occurred to me until I heard that statement, and then I just thought, oh, well, that's easy, and who's going to disagree with that?
Well, and the law that you all brought up that you have here in Montana, that we're not sure if it's been used yet, but vacating the prostitution convictions for victims of trafficking. That's huge. Every state should have that. Why do we not all have that? This is not the FBI, this is Carla.
Yes.
But let's do that. So, yes.
Yeah.
So let's open it up for questions. How about somebody from Porter? If we have somebody from Porter, why don't you come up to the microphone? Where's the microphone hiding at? Come on up if you have a question. The mic's over here, over there.
I formerly was in law enforcement, and I found that a number of these young ladies that were recruited by organized crime were turned on to drugs right away. And I think this is a message that ought to be brought forward to the young people in the audience, that they would get them hooked on drugs, and after that, they were just very dependent on their pimps for their further addiction. So I think that should be addressed.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's done in various ways now. Sometimes they'll hook them on drugs. Sometimes they use the drugs to, they'll use marijuana to chill them out if the girl is upset. They'll use alcohol to chill her out if she's upset. If she is not willing to put forth the effort, then they'll give her ecstasy or meth. So they use the drugs to cause them to be dependent, but they also use them to control them and force them to go out and do those acts by literally altering their moods with the drugs. So they're very sophisticated, and it's good to bring that up. Thank you.
Do you think that there is any cases that are more important than others?
As far as human trafficking cases, or different type, like money laundering over human trafficking or kidnapping, or
Like human trafficking over sex slaves?
well, that's kind of the same, but all human trafficking cases are important. All cases are important, but I've been working human trafficking for a long time, so those are very important to me, and I think to all of us up here. But thank you for the question. All cases are very important.
I'd like to call your attention back to the title of this session, which was on the prevalence of trafficking in Montana and the U.S. I appreciate your efforts in Montana and the comments you made about not having statistics about the Montana situation. Do you have any statistics on a national, or estimates on a national level, that can give us a sense of the extent of this social problem?
Not with me. They exist. You can email me later, and I can get some of those out to you, but it is large on a national scale. Basically, the statistics I could provide would be based off of our investigations. Every year, because of the TVPA, there's a portion in there where we have to provide statistics to Congress with regard to the number of cases that we've opened in the previous year, and the amount of resources that we're putting towards that as the FBI, and believe those are probably publicly available. I'm not 100% sure. But it is prevalent, and it appears the more resources that we put towards it, the more cases we have. Go figure, because they're, like Cyndee said, we all have different hats, and to be able to dedicate people specifically to this violation or to this problem really increases the amount of casework that we can do.
I have one thought on that, and that is that the last legislature charged the Montana Department of Justice with distributing a poster with the human trafficking hotline number on it, which we now have. I did bring some with me, and we also have them posted, I think, at every rest area. So one of our sources of data is actually the Polaris Project on the other end of the hotline. And as those posters go out and we make that number more available to citizens and also to victims, we're going to have at least a source of data coming in about the number of calls about trafficking in Montana that will be better than the data we have now. But I don't want to steal the thunder of the Polaris Project, because they are presenting later.
There's definitely not a field office in America that does not have open human trafficking cases. Everyone has human trafficking cases on the books that they're investigating, whether they be adult or labor trafficking cases or domestic child cases. It's everywhere. It varies by population. For example, you'll have more cases in Los Angeles and San Diego than you will in Montana, just by sheer numbers of population. But every field office is working these cases.
Yes.
Hi, I'd like to know if these adoptions gone wrong is on anybody's radar, either locally or nationally, where either a couple adopts a child from overseas or locally, and there's an issue, and they get on social media and they trade children, or they get rid of the children. They're not, there's no, you don't go to an office and say, I'm going to trade in Susie for John. You just give Susie and John away to another couple, and God only knows if they're into some kind of trafficking or something. Is that on anybody's radar?
They definitely are. Unfortunately, I'm trying to think the best way to put this. The trading or selling of children in that manner does not fall under the statutes for human trafficking, but that doesn't mean that it's not being investigated. And if there are elements of that crime that do fall under the statutes that we title as human trafficking, that they're not investigated in that way as well. So a lot of times you'll find them being worked as a wire fraud case or fraud against the government case or things like that. There was a case in San Diego several years ago now, I guess 2 or 3 years ago now, where a woman was brokering children by essentially tricking families who wanted to have children and saying that there were women who had children up for adoption, and then she was going to the women and telling the women that they were I just lost the word. Well, what's the name where they have the child and surrogates? They were being surrogates. They said, you're going to be a surrogate for this couple, and then telling the couple that she had a baby she wanted to adopt. So they were essentially creating children to sell them that didn't previously exist. It was a terrible case. We racked our brains for months trying to figure out what human trafficking. It's got to be trafficking. I mean, they're creating things and selling them, and babies and selling them, and this is not okay. And it ended up getting worked as a fraud case, and they were convicted. But it goes to any of our trafficking cases, really, whatever statute we can use to get them off the streets and out of that business to protect the citizens of America, we will do that. And then if there are additional charges we can tack on, we absolutely will. So I don't know if you have something to add.
I think of this as absence of proof is not proof of absence, and I'm wondering what's being done to drag our smaller community law enforcement into education to understand this really is happening. It reminds me of the meth epidemic, where we don't have meth in our community until suddenly the trailer explodes out in the woods and they find meth dumps and all kinds of things going on. So what's being done to drag these naysayers into the light to get them to understand it really is happening, and for them to recognize it as this isn't a drug bust with a young girl who's a druggie. It is a drug bust with a young girl who is being trafficked for the enjoyment of the pimps and the drug pushers. And the other thing is, Safe in the Bitterroot is our domestic violence shelter. They are an awesome, awesome organization. They are streaming this conference today and tomorrow, and I am sure they would be loved to be talked to and work this out, because they agree that there is a huge crossover between domestic violence and trafficking?
So what I would say with regards to that is that we are reaching out to every law enforcement agency in Montana, and we've had a very good mix, I guess I should say, in terms of who we've reached out to so far. We're going to continue to reach out to those agencies, but that being said, I also think that the mentality behind sex trafficking in particular is very long-term. And actually Dana has the statistics on that, which I think is amazing, but it's just going to take time. It's exactly like meth and exactly like domestic violence and exactly like everything else, that we've put the spotlight on it now, and what we need to do is just continue to educate until we stop, until we put the societal ban on people buying children and women and men for sex. That we just have to get the mentality changed.
Well, and one of the challenges in Montana's smaller law enforcement jurisdiction that is very real for them is they often have the smallest budgets, and they often have the smallest number of staff. So if they send one sheriff's deputy to training for a week, they have got exactly one deputy covering the whole county while that other person's gone. And so we know that, and we're trying to develop ways to take training to them, to do it in a way that is respectful of their time. And then also, for those of you who aren't familiar with all of the aspects of criminal justice in Montana, those jurisdictions frequently will contact the Montana Department of Justice, the Division of Criminal Investigation, where we have state investigators. If they request help from us, our investigators are trained, and that's what we do, is we go. I mean, if we get a call and they need help now, we have an agent in a car on the way there. So that's another way that we're trying to support those small jurisdictions in terms of training and education.
We're mindful of a lot of times budgets are a huge issue in the local sheriff's offices and police departments, and so we're very mindful of that. And I was just talking with Highway Patrol yesterday, and they were saying, how long does the training last? And I said, we will make it last however long you want it to last. We can do a half a day or we can do 2 days. It's what we typically try to do is half to a 3/4 day specifically, so that the agencies are not paying for overnight, because we know. So we try to find a free location that we can set up shop in, and then that way, and we make sure that we get the post credits and do everything like that, so that we can encourage our office and encourage the agencies to send their agents and their law enforcement officers there. That is not going to cost them, you know, oftentimes, and I'm not kidding, their training budget will be $1,000 a year. So if you're sending somebody to a 2-day overnight, there's your training budget. And so when you have domestic violence and gun crime and drugs and everything else, that's what we're dealing with. So we're mindful of that. We are trying to address that and keep that in the back of our minds when we're putting on these presentations.
And these shorter half day or 3/4 day presentations and trainings really do make a difference. It's the exposure, and the more they can get, if we do it little by little, a half a day here, 3/4 a day here, the more they hear it and start to see it in their own communities and reach out for the resources that are available, and having someone from Dana's agency, just knowing to call Dana and get someone there to help is a huge step. And then they learn from that as well through the process of their first case, and it gets them excited, and they see how the things that they're taught in that half day actually do come into play, and it becomes more prevalent that the attitude changes over time.
We got about 5 minutes left, a little bit less, so quick questions.
My name is Kat Werner. I'm with the YWCA here in Missoula, and I'm a member of our local task force. And as a task force, and we have Missoula Police Department, Sheriff's Department, we just brought somebody from Ravalli County on board, the Ayers Native Children's Trauma Center here on campus. So working on kind of, getting as many stakeholders on board as possible. And we've definitely identified outreach and education as one of our main priorities. So, really focusing on educating mall security, hotel staff, and we know hotel staff can play a really big role, in working with survivors. And so, I'm just really excited to hear that there's more and more task forces popping up. And, what I'm hoping is really that there is kind of that just awareness out there, because I think sometimes I'm realizing we're still operating in these little bubbles in our different regions. So, just a thought or suggestions, just to kind of bringing us together and kind of sharing the expertise and what everybody's doing. One of the things we always talk about in our task force is how can we address kind of the epidemic of young girls and women being advertised and exploited on Backpage.com. And so I'm hoping that's one of the questions for you guys to talk about on a federal and state level, what is being done. When I go on there and look, I see, these girls that are coming through that are being advertised as only being here for a few days, and I think that's obviously, the mode of what's happening. So what is being done, kind of address the internet crimes against children and women being advertised? And then looking at the upcoming legislative sessions, are you guys aware of anything regarding the trafficking law in Montana? Any appropriations bills, any funding that might come through for victim services? And running a domestic violence shelter here in town, as this was mentioned before, there is a lot of overlap. And having worked with minors that are survivors of trafficking, knowing the limited resources that are available, as Dr. Foley was saying, just the inequality that exists and the systematic root cause of exploitation. So, yeah, I was hoping to hear some of your thoughts on that.
Those are easy.
Okay, you got 2 minutes.
So so in answer to the first question, the Backpage, the internet marketing of young women, we do have internet crimes against children task forces in Montana. In, I think, most of our law enforcement jurisdictions of any size, and also the State Department of Justice has internet crimes against children investigators who tell me that there are so many cases of young women being marketed on the internet that we can't possibly even get to all of them. I think that question about what could we do to get that off the internet really becomes something for Congress, because it ultimately comes down to being a free speech issue. I think there have been some baby steps in getting some of the most heinous stuff off the internet, Craigslist, those kinds of things, but they're just baby steps, and that needs to be grappled with as a real social issue. Second part of the question was the domestic violence shelters. What was the second? So I had an answer. Oh, legislation. Okay, I have a partial answer. So at least from the Montana Department of Justice, where I am in state government, we're currently in our executive planning process because, as you know, the legislature convenes the first week of January 2015. And Attorney General Fox is very concerned about human trafficking. And so we're in a dialogue right now, department-wide, about what kinds of legislation might we want to bring. We can't speak for what other departments or citizens might bring, and whether or not we can put together a package and ask also for some funding to help even with training and education.
Okay, we've got 2 more Porter students. We're out of time, but I'll let you ask your questions if they're quick.
I was wondering, you've been talking about all these programs to find slavery and to deal with the slaves at present, but what happens to the trafficked from out of the country, to the people who don't speak the language and they have no resources? Are there any programs to help them?
There are a lot of programs to help them, actually. That's a very good question. Department of Homeland Security, through their Immigrations and Customs, has programs, as well as there are a lot of NGOs or non-governmental organizations who have shelters. Health and Human Services as well has refugee benefits specifically for adults and children, and they would begin to fall into that category if you were trafficked here from another country. And the vast majority, I think all of the federal agencies have interpreters that are available, so if a local agency comes across someone and they don't have those resources, they can call their friendly local FBI agent who can make a call and get some of those services, as well as a lot of the NGOs also have interpretation services, and the National Human Trafficking Resource Center has various languages on their hotline as well. So they are out there, and we help anyone and everyone we can.
Last question.
When a teenage girl gets in a fight with her parents and they leave for 2 or 3 days, do you think after they ran out of money, do you think their first thought is to go to prostitution, or do they have any other thoughts before that?
I think their first thought isn't to go to prostitution, but I think their first thought is to get shelter and food, and I think that there are pimps out there who are wicked and evil, and, can I say that? And will take advantage of that situation. And so they might offer them a chance to stay in their hotel rooms or give them some food, I'll buy you a hamburger, and then they, over the course of time, if the girl feels comfortable there, or the boy, whoever's run away, feels comfortable there, that they'll use that to continually exploit and say, hey, I've done this for you, what are you going to do for me? Oh, I know, you can go prostitute, have a nice day. So that, it's not typically their first thought, but it does happen quite a bit.
And it's peer pressure too. I think a lot of girls will get other girls. See, the pimps are smart. They're so smart because they don't go up and walk in and ask a girl to do it. They'll approach the young girl with how to make easy money, how to own your own car, how to buy your own cell phone. Oh, and by the way, look at Becky, and look at how great Becky is. And then they stick Becky on the next victim to, and I'm sorry, Jim, because I know you want to wrap up, but it's...
That's how it goes.
Yes.
All right, well, thank you. I want to thank Dr. Kim, Dr. Engstrom, the Mansfield Center, and our three speakers.